Hi, welcome to Just Us Law. My name is attorney Ani Desilets, and I'm joined by my partner, attorney Lisa Vincent. And today, we're going to talk about a Netflix documentary which was based on a true story called Take Care of Maya. Take Care of Maya is about, at the time, a 10-year-old young girl who had two parents who had a little bit of difficulty conceiving, but they were able to have Maya. And Maya was diagnosed at 10 years old with a disease called complex regional pain syndrome. And she was under the care of a doctor named Dr. Kirkpatrick, and he had begun ketamine infusion treatments to treat her disorder. And I should say that mom was by trade an infusion nurse. Dad was a retired firefighter. And so her complex regional pain disorder, she would suffer from blurred vision. Her limbs would cramp up and contort, just in unbearable pain out of seemingly nowhere. Maybe just a touch on the skin would send her into just unbearable pain. So they had found this doctor who prescribed these low-dose ketamine treatments to her. And the parents noticed she was getting a little bit better in terms of managing the pain. And then they went on to a different doctor who continued to prescribe it. The original doctor got a little bit too costly. The medical insurance wouldn't cover it. They went on to a different doctor, Dr. Hannah, up for another year or so. In 2016, she suffers from some extreme stomach pain. And no one knew why. So the parents decided, I believe they resided in Florida, they decided to bring her to John Hopkins Hospital. And while at the hospital, the mother insisted on the hospital continuing the ketamine treatments for this complex regional pain problem. And this triggered, while at the hospital, this triggered some suspicions about child abuse. The doctors believed that this low dose ketamine wasn't actually helping the child, and so they reported it to their version of CPS. In particular, they corresponded with the child abuse pediatrician by the name of Dr. Smith. They interviewed the father for about 10 minutes, and then the child was essentially taken into their version of DCF, their state custody. Dr. Smith had believed the mother was actually suffering from, the child was suffering from medical abuse, and the mom was suffering from Munchausen, and the daughter of Munchausen by proxy. So the hospital prevented, from that point on, all contact between the mother and Maya, despite Maya's pleas to the contrary. There was a psychological evaluation done, I believe through the juvenile court, and it revealed, in fact, that mother did not suffer from Munchausen. So the parents were essentially split at this point. If the father sort of held his views apart from mom and towed the line, if you will, he would be allowed to see the child. And so he did that, and he was able to see the child. She was in state care for approximately 3 months before her mother committed suicide. Her mother had hung herself in the garage, I believe, and before killing herself, she had written something. And what triggered this for her was she was in a juvenile court hearing and begged the juvenile court judge, the child protection judge, if she could hug her daughter. And the judge said no. And not believing there was any hope to see her daughter again or reconnect, she ended her life. And from there, Netflix makes this documentary, and we have a lawsuit that ensues against John Hopkins and against the child abuse pediatrician, Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, I believe, settled her liability outside in a settlement outside of the court process. And then we have a judgment from John Hopkins for $200+ million. And Maya lives the rest of her life without her mother because of the suspected child abuse. Pretty heavy stuff, very good Very good, very sad, but very good documentary that really, one of the things the documentary did was incorporate a little bit of other stories of people who've gone through the medical child abuse system. Um, she's certainly not alone. The mother was certainly not alone, and the family was not alone. But yeah.
So, looking at the story of Maya and her mother and the involvement of child abuse pediatricians, the involvement of a well-renowned children's hospital, the premise that, parents who viewed themselves as being dutiful and going above and beyond to meet the needs of their child end up being labeled as having what is really a very rare psychological condition of the Munchausen's by proxy. And the viewers here in Connecticut, anybody who's paid attention to these types of stories will remember the story of a Connecticut child, Justina Pelletier, who had been diagnosed with a relatively rare or unusual medical condition, who had been undergoing what could be perceived as atypical treatment, ended up at an emergency room in Boston, where a very similar story unfolded, and the child was isolated. In that particular case, the perception was that the child herself was suffering a psychiatric condition. She ended up confined on a psychiatric ward. She was denied, or reportedly denied, access to the treatments that had been helping her. At some point, there was an expectation that she should be able to walk, and she was denied access to her wheelchair, various things of that nature. Stemming, the common denominator, I think there are a few, but the one that I really wanted to talk about on this show is child abuse pediatrics, and the power that they have in many, many cases. And obviously these are two extreme cases. The reality is we have multiple child abuse pediatricians in our state. There are child abuse pediatricians at all of our children's hospitals here in Connecticut. They maintain a very close relationship with our Department of Children and Families and their involvement in investigating claims of child abuse and neglect. And people who live in our state, I think, need and deserve to know about this aspect of medical care, right? Because when you go to a doctor, you take your child to the doctor, there's a level of trust, there's a level of confidence that you're working with a professional who shares a common interest with you. And based on my work in child protection over 10 years at this point, I've seen child abuse pediatricians do good work. I've seen cases where parents quite honestly did not understand that they were engaging with child abuse pediatricians, had absolutely no idea that that is what they were dealing with, and calling my office in a frenzy when they get an order that kicks them out of the hospital, or isolates them to a waiting room, or they are told that their child is going to stay at the hospital and they are not going to be permitted to stay. Often comes as a bit of a surprise to many people. And then in a broader scale, on a nationwide basis, this premise of child abuse pediatricians questioning the care and treatment that has been prescribed by other doctors, and where the line is, what level of expertise applies. In the case of Justina Pelletier, a lawsuit brought against the child abuse pediatricians and the hospital in that state failed. That civil case was not, they did not prevail. I know in the matter of Maya, the liability really seems to run to the impact on the mother and the sad outcomes of that for her. But in terms of our viewership here, right, and just thinking about parents raising their children, I think they deserve to know that there are these places at our children's hospitals where child abuse pediatricians are employed, and many families are sent there.
Knowingly and unknowingly.
Knowingly and unknowingly. So any child, and our mandatory reporting laws in Connecticut are very broad. So basically every doctor, every nurse, bus driver, school teacher, every licensed professional of every kind, perhaps with the exception of child protection attorneys,
Not yet, anyhow.
mandated to report. The question is, what are they reporting? And many people think that they're reporting abuse or neglect. That's not actually real. These mandated reporters are prohibited from assessing whether it was or was not neglect or abuse. They are tasked to report concerns of things. And that includes doctors. So if a parent takes their child to the pediatrician for care, or if a parent takes their child to the emergency room for care following an injury or significant illness, those doctors are mandated reporters as well. And it is not uncommon for physicians to refer a family to a scan program. So what is a scan program, Attorney Desilets, and what do you know about it?
So a SCAN program stands for Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect. And so most of our major hospitals in Connecticut have them. We have one at Connecticut Children's Medical Center. Yale has their version of it. And it's a team devoted to looking for and finding child abuse. The way I see it commonly, how parents end up there in the child protection world is sometimes they'll go to the emergency room. Let's say a child has an injury on their leg, and the doctor gives them a look over and comes to see a few faint healing bruises in different stages of healing. Calls up and says, "Hey, you ought to go to this scan referral in CCMC." Parents have no idea what that is. They're getting medical care for their child, and they end up over there. And depending on what they find with the bruises, enter DCF perhaps. That's one way. Another way is DCF gets called because school has reports the child is showing up with matted hair, looks unkempt. School goes and meets with the child, notices a bruise on the wrist, might end up that way. So there's a few different ways. But I often find that parents don't really know when they're being told to go there, whether it's through other medical personnel or whether it's through the Department of Children and Families, where they're actually going and what they're actually, making themselves susceptible to at these places. I think that what the work these people do is probably very difficult to look at actual cases of child abuse. I can't imagine what that's like. But like any other imperfect system, there are cases that get trapped in that system that don't belong there. And so Those are the cases that concern me. And I find, with Maya's case, and there was also a documentary made about the Pelletier Justine's case as well. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But in those two cases, the striking similarity for me is loud parents who advocate for what their child needs, even if it's disparate or different from what the regular pediatrician would say or what an average person would say. Like take ketamine treatments in the case of Maya. That was what, 2015? But we're giving low-dose ketamine treatments now for depression. So what was odd back in 2015, we're now marketing for psychiatric patients for depression. So just in the matter of 8 years, would it be so odd for her disorder? I don't know. We certainly see billboards with ketamine, low-dose ketamine treatment. So anyway, I think the commonality with those parents and perhaps other parents that become ensnared in the system is, not all parents, but that sense of advocating for what they think their child needs, or in Maya's case, her mother was a nurse. It was an infusion nurse. It wasn't any dummy to medical care, and had been following the advice of a specialist in the field, who dealt with this day in and day out, so. But in comes Dr. Smith, the child abuse pediatrician. Ketamine, child, what? No, and
Right.
and there we are.
So, I mean, a couple things come out of that. So, suspected child abuse and neglect. When parents hear that, they are generally concerned about that. They want to understand more about that. I do think, and I say this with respect for the professionals. These are doctors. They're highly trained. Give them the benefit of the doubt. They don't find abuse or neglect in every case. They do evaluate patients and say, "There's nothing going on here. This child is fine. The family is fine. Go on their way." I don't think they mean any harm, and I don't think there's any harm per se in having such a program. We want to know if a child is being abused or neglected. But I do think it's a bit disingenuous to refer parents who don't have the knowledge that we have to say, "Listen, we really need you to bring your child for a scan over at the Children's Hospital." I do think that people are fooled by that. I have had people sit in my office who absolutely had no idea that they were going through a forensic investigation process. That is what it is. It is a forensic investigation of a child's condition, interview of the parents, an assessment, blood work. We do skeletal x-rays. We do a full scan, which sounds really good to a parent who's worried about their child, takes on an entirely different meaning when they understand what scan stands for.
Well, or even on that point, there are parents who, when they do find out what it is, they're like, they've told me, yeah, well, I wanted to go. I wanted to prove, that really I hadn't done anything intentional, or that, I hadn't neglected the child, not realizing the barrage of testing, right? It's not just extending to the one particular potential injury, but any mark anywhere,
Right.
and what doors that could open up. So.
Right, and the full skeletal x-rays.
Correct, yeah.
Especially of young children.
Yeah.
And there are some questions. I mean, child abuse pediatrics on a nationwide scale has been subjected to some level of criticism.
Is it Iowa or Ohio where they were finding that one particular place was just churning out all those cases? We should look into that. There was the one state that came under big fire because they were just turning out all these cases that turned out to be bogus.
There was a doctor tied up in that, and I'd have to really look into that to make sure I knew the name. But you can see how the practice
becomes a cottage
could
industry.
be subject to abuse. And even here in Connecticut, I hate to say, it's become easy to send kids to scan. I see kids being sent to scan today that certainly were not being sent to scan 10 years ago. It's a different volume, I'd be very curious to look at the numbers. But in terms of, who is being sent to scan, by whom, under what conditions, I think there's been a substantial change. In fact, I think we recently had a case where a referral was made to scan for a child that had never had any type of injuries whatsoever. Is that ringing a bell for you?
Not off the top of my head, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, the referral wasn't from DCF or a doctor. The referral was from another service provider, a lay service provider, who said, "Hey, you should go for this scan. This is a good
yes,
idea."
ringing a bell, ringing a bell now. Yes, yes.
So,
Well, and I think part of that, and you and I have talked about this in the past, is mandated reporting laws, and how I think that a lot of these quote unquote mandated reporters are afraid. Not all of them, but a lot of them are afraid of not reporting, the consequences of not reporting, right?
right.
And I think that fear that drives a lot of calls that you hope, I don't know, that you hope are dealt with properly. But I think that it's a lot of it's fear. I mean, we don't have a nationwide uptick in child abuse, so.
Right, exactly. There's no evidence that we have a nationwide uptick in child abuse. In terms of, the story of Maya and, this premise that a parent has Munchausen's or that a child's medical treatment is atypical, we see these cases in Connecticut as well. Generally, these child abuse pediatricians come in a different way in those cases where we have children hospitalized for legitimate medical conditions. And in the course of hospitalization, questions arise as to whether the parent's perception of the child's condition is accurate, number one. And number two, whether the treatment being provided by some doctor who doesn't practice at this hospital, right? Whatever, this doctor that we don't know here is prescribing this treatment that we wouldn't use here. And does that amount to child neglect? And I think that's an entirely different question, obviously with serious consequences in the case of Maya, similarly in Justina Pelletier. I've had a couple of cases over the years involving medical child abuse, medical child neglect, they call it. I've even represented a person who was accused of Munchausen's by proxy, which was not proven by any psychological test or whatever. It's a term that is thrown around.
It's
rather
used
easily.
flippantly, yeah.
So, just
what is
in
it?
terms
Fictitious, there's a new euphemism for it. Fictitious disorder, fictitious something disorder.
Yeah. I don't know the exact acronym, but you are correct. They have a new label for it. It's a rough time to be a parent.
And then you look at a case which has also recently been in the news because she's finally been released from prison, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, whose mother put her through all kinds of treatments for all kinds of things, none of which she had, and multiple doctors who knew and turned a blind eye. It was a different time period, but nonetheless, turned a blind eye, and really, this child went through the worst torture medically, imaginable. Ended up killing her mother. I'm not justifying that, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it just brings to light, and I think it's important for people in our state to be aware that, parents have the right and the duty to take care of their kids, to make decisions for them, to get them what they need. The fact of the matter is, in this day and age, it's not without oversight. It's not without second guessing. There's all kinds of things built into our system where families can get tied up, and not minimizing the fact that children are abused. I've had cases in my office where children have been abused. There's people who are incarcerated for harming their children. But I do think that the level of medical oversight, medical involvement, as well as, the DCF oversight, really exposes families in our state to just an awareness that there is oversight. They're not really entirely free to make decisions in terms of seeking, a unique medical treatment, or going to a foreign state to get a specialist for their kid, and
Or even in certain cases, foregoing vaccinations in the state of Connecticut, like foregoing vaccinations that are deemed necessary.
right.
And you and I might differ on that question, but right, I mean, that could land somebody in the crosshairs of the Department of Children and Families, and
Well, we both acknowledge, some of those families that don't believe in vaccinations and who exercise their decision making, find themselves calling our office
Right.
for advice and assistance because they get scared.
right.
That and the home births. So,
So it's interesting, in lieu of our past show about Mr. Ethan Crumbly and his mother and the necessity to watch your child and parent properly, and now on this show we're telling you parent with caution, and you have oversight, and it's just interesting when you
yeah, the whole idea of parenthood is taken on a new level in this era. But I think day to day, the work that we do, we see too much in some ways, but I think it's a good idea for people in Connecticut to be aware of what we're dealing with.
And so I think that's all for today. I want to thank you for joining us at Just Us Law Group. Again, I'm Ani Desilets, joined by attorney Vincent, and that's a wrap.
Nick Augustino right here at the East Side Restaurant. We always have the complete full dinner menu. Knockwurst, bratwurst, sauerbraten, potato pancakes, red cabbage, rice pudding, cream pies, all the desserts that Germany had to offer. I always do something different. Yes, I do. I brought seafood to the beer garden at the East Side Restaurant. East Side Restaurant, your German destination restaurant in Connecticut. Tiki-taka, hoi, hoi, hoi!
Follow us on Instagram at nutmeg.tv.